welcome you. Wherever you come from, we welcome you. Whomever you love, we welcome you. Whoever you are, we welcome you. Wherever you come from, we welcome you. Whomever you love, we welcome you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Edge, and I will be presenting service today. Robin Perry and Kevin McClooney are providing technical assistance. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. We are glad that we can keep in touch and support our community even if we can't be together in person. Please be aware that we are recording the service and it will be posted on our Facebook and YouTube pages. We joined together this morning to seek justice, equality, and fairness in the world. Our hearts are touched by the human need we feel around us, whether far away or within reach of our hands. We come here to be together because this is how we believe our lives are best lived, in questioning and in conversation, in compassion and in service, in gratitude and in joy, in companionship and in love. It is good to be together with you this morning. Please take a moment to think of all your friends at MVUUC, greet them with a comment in the chat box, and remember that you can still reach out to them via email, phone, social media, or video chat. Physical distancing does not need to mean emotional distancing. Let us support one another. Visitors, as we are a diverse group with varying interests and beliefs, our services are varied in format, tone, and topic. We encourage you to view several services to gain a good understanding of our congregation. If you'd like to receive our weekly email newsletter, please email us at news@mvuuc.org. Excuse me for one moment. I'm just going to make sure my computer does not try to restart itself. Thank you. MVUUC remains committed to supporting our members and friends during this difficult time of social distancing. For that reason, we are coordinating assistance with groceries, phone calls, and other needs. If this sounds like something that would be helpful to you, please send an email to sac@mvuuc.org with your name and what kind of assistance you would like to request. Now is the time for announcements. Announcements can be sent ahead of time to services@mvuuc.org to be read. If you have an important announcement now, you can raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of the participant box in Zoom. Then we will announce your name and turn on your mic and camera so you can make your announcement yourself. Robin, are there any announcements today?
Yes, Megan has an announcement in the chat.
Hello. So today is the second and final day for the MVUUC food drive benefiting the Brown Bag Food Project. So if you haven't done so already, and I know a number of you already have, but you can bring your donations to the MVUUC building today from 1 to 2 p.m. I will be there to collect everything, and I will be bringing all donations to the Brown Bag Food Project this afternoon. So thank you in advance, and thank you to everybody who already donated. Also, if you're interested in joining our next anti-racism book club, where we're reading White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, please email me at sac@mvuuc.org. Thank you.
We have
Any other?
another announcement in the chat from Noelle. Please send us MVUUC pictures. We are in the process of updating the website. Check it out. It has a whole new design. Thanks to me and Lisa, who worked on it a lot. Recent pictures will make it even more awesome, and we are specifically looking for pictures, preferably about 2018 onwards. So if you have any pictures from any MVUUC events, or even if you were just on the grounds doing something like working in the garden or something like, or walking in the trail, please send them to us. And then one more announcement via email comes from Winnie. There will be a Spirit in Practice workshop today that will meet after service 1 p.m. on Zoom. You can contact Winnie at winrexx@gmail.com if you have any questions. And I believe that is it for now.
Okay, thank you, Robin.
So the chalice will be lit today by Tom Edge. Please join me in reading the words for the chalice lighting that appear as a comment in the chat box. We light this chalice to find inner peace, love for each other, and faith in ourselves, to be welcoming to whomever we meet and kind to all living creatures. So gather around this light of hope as we share this together.
And now, Ruth DeBrot will lead us in a song, You'll Never Walk Alone. Our opening words today come from former UUA co-moderator, Elandria Williams. The history and legacy of Unitarian Universalism are shaped as much by Emerson, Foss, and Channing as it is by the ancestors in our congregations. We come to it through different avenues: the internet, an invitation, reading the Transcendentalists, or as babies or little kids. I came as a fourth grader to my congregation, the Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Church, in Knoxville, Tennessee, or TVUUC. This community helped bring me into social justice struggles in the world around me and inside the UUA. They brought me as a child to the place where I now work, the Highlander Center. My church opened so many doors because they held young people in high esteem and encouraged our leadership in the church and community. I will never forget going to our district's Journey Towards Wholeness Transformation Team meeting, the UUA's anti-racist program, and realizing that I was the youngest person there by nearly 15 years. My religious education teachers, friends' parents, and spirit aunts and uncles were and still are community leaders in everything from nuclear disarmament to anti-racism and anti-oppression issues. They protested US military involvement in Central America and stood behind the parent of a classmate as she transitioned from male to female in the early 90s. They have been my inspiration as I work to support others who are called by their faith to change hearts, minds, and communities. My church changed forever on July 27th, 2008, when an armed man came into the sanctuary and killed 2 UU leaders, one a member of TVUUC and the other a member of Westside Church. This rocked our church to its core. When I first heard about it, I didn't know who had been killed. My mom, my friends, and their parents, or others who had nurtured me my entire life. I realized something that day that has stayed with me ever since. No matter what issues I have with other Unitarian Universalists regarding our visions of God or spirit, justice, race, and age, at the root of everything is community, love, and faith. That day, something larger than our individual beliefs rose up in my mind. I thought of the principles, values, and family that are the connective tissue of our faith community and that held us weeks after the shooting, six months later on our 60th anniversary, and still today. I am part of the connective tissue that holds the legacy and future of our faith. We are the children of freedom fighters, visionaries, and radical liberal theologians. We are the phoenix rising out of the ashes of the McCarthy era and the civil rights, women's, and queer liberation movements. We are the survivors and beneficiaries of youth-led and youth-focused beliefs and programming that encouraged us to be change makers, boundary pushers, and institutionalists at the same time. We are and will be the ministers, religious educators, congregational presidents, organizers, and social change leaders our faith has led us to be. We wear our faith as tattoos on our bodies and in our hearts, as testaments to the blood, tears, dreams, and inspirations of our community ancestors and elders. Once upon a time, when I was working on my undergraduate history thesis at Rutgers University, I remember reading an article about the history of protests at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The author included a wonderfully cheerful story of a young mother taking her child to the memorial, pointing up at the giant seated figure and asking her child, "Who is that?" The child solemnly and correctly answered, "Abe Lincoln." The mother, clearly pleased, then asked, "And who freed the slaves?" The same child broke out into a wide grin and, with the supreme confidence that only comes in childhood, exclaimed, "Martin Luther King." There is a subtle genius in that child's response. On the site of the Lincoln Memorial, before the largest civil rights demonstration to that point in American history, King had reminded an international audience that 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans were still not free. Indeed, that same year, 1963, James Baldwin took much the same position when he wrote in an open letter to his nephew, quote, "You know, and I know, that the country is celebrating 100 years of freedom, 100 years too soon." I give that child much more credit than I give many adults in at least recognizing that the end of legal chattel slavery is not the same as the dawning of freedom or racial equality. I've been thinking a great deal about that precocious youth over the last few days, while I considered what to say as we commemorate the holiday in Dr. King's honor. On previous occasions, I have addressed this congregation on Dr. King's legacies, on the need for greater education about the history of race and racism in the United States, and the links between both of these issues and contemporary anti-racist movements. I have railed against the way that we have defanged King's striding critiques of the United States, including his attacks on the triple threat of racism, militarism, and materialism. Recently, historian Patrick Hagopian addressed how this affects our attempts to memorialize King, especially in the federal monument that now resides in his honor in Washington, D.C. Hagopian noted that the organizers of this memorial constantly emphasized the theme of King's quote-unquote universal appeal, and thus strove to create a monument that represented him in a way that everyone could embrace. In doing so, they chose to divorce him from the very issues and words that made him an American icon in the first place. They chose a quotation for the monument that separates King from the ideas for which he constantly risked his life, and then instead elevates him as an individual above his peers and fellow activists in the civil rights movement, in the anti-war movement, and in the movement against poverty. This is one of many fears that scholars and activists alike share when it comes to the elevation of one singular leader above anyone else. At the height of King's fame in the 1960s, people like Ella Baker warned that our obsession with charismatic leadership was dangerous. It not only took attention away from the day-to-day organizing that makes a movement successful in the long run, but it raised serious questions about how a movement responds if it no longer has that charismatic leader. From the perspective of our own time, we can also recognize the dangers when the elevation of one leader is accomplished by widespread historical amnesia as to what they actually said, did, or thought. Of course, these efforts to elevate King are often accompanied by a very different process of forgetting, the willful attempt to render racism as a thing of the past. Conservatives and liberals alike selectively quote King, talk about his ultimate triumph over racism before his assassination, and remind us how much better we are as a nation than we were 50 or 60 years ago. King is used to assuage white guilt, to assure white America that everything is fine, to tell them that King would approve of where we are now, even as we face resegregated schools, discrimination in housing and hiring, vast economic inequalities along racial lines, and the specter of racial profiling, violence, even death at the hands of law enforcement. There is an intense fear that marks our commemoration of King's birthday every year, a fear that our lofty rhetoric about racial equality for a few days in mid-January stands in sharp contrast against our actions and priorities the rest of the year. Maybe that is the greatest disservice we have done to King's legacy through this holiday. In rendering the fight against racism as a relic of our history, in ignoring our own duty to take up that fight here and now, we have undermined King's attempts to give us a language for analyzing oppression, the tools to bring it out into full public view, and the desire to genuinely change those conditions. The entire point of King's activist life was to help empower others to take up these causes, not to assume that they were finished or that someone else would do the work for us. This is why Ella Baker objected to the top-down structure of so many civil rights organizations and instead encouraged activists to think in terms of participatory democracy. Baker famously admonished activists that, quote, strong people don't need strong leaders. In saying this, she was not implying that leaders would not emerge naturally or that the concept of leadership was bad in and of itself. Rather, she felt that people can look at their own lives and communities and assess what needs to change. They can be the engines for change at the local level, rather than waiting for someone of national or international importance to change conditions for them. From her own work as a grassroots organizer with the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and other groups, Baker saw firsthand that when people have a voice in these movements, they are more invested. They will give of their time and energy to actively support these struggles. When they are being heard and not simply dictated to, they become activists themselves. At the heart of her activism, Baker had an undying faith in the ability of people to participate in their own liberation. But that process needed to start with an honest assessment of where things stand. SNCC activists fondly recall all-night meetings at which every single person had a right to be heard, every opinion was taken into account, and they did not leave until they developed a course of action on which everyone could agree. Miss Baker sometimes attended these meetings, wearing a mask over her nose and mouth because the cigarette smoke in the room aggravated her asthma. She amazed her much younger colleagues with her willingness to work with them through the night and impressed them with her ability to help them sharpen their own thoughts. Miss Baker didn't tell them, no, you're doing this wrong. She asked them, what do you want to accomplish? And is this the best way to get there? Her instructions to student activists 60 years ago should resonate with us in 2021. Instead of using the King holiday to once again offer vague support for racial equality, we should ask ourselves to define the problem in concrete terms, in desired outcomes, and in a defined course of action. Borrowing from Miss Baker, we need to remind ourselves that we are strong people who are capable of this difficult yet necessary work. And we need to start here, in our congregation, in our own denomination. Recently, members of the UUA have set forth a proposal for what they call the eighth principle. The idea behind this came from Paula Cole Jones, the former president of DRUM, or Diverse and Revolutionary Unitarian Universalist Multicultural Ministries. Based on her work with congregations, she felt that too many UU followers felt they could abide by our 7 core principles without pushing themselves to address issues of systemic racism in their own communities and congregations. Thus, she and others within the UUA created an 8th principle and encouraged congregations to adopt this language for themselves. Quote, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community, by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions." In pushing for the adoption of this language, members of DRUM and of Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, or BLUE, have tried to educate white congregants about the good and the bad aspects of UU history with regard to racism. They point to the outstanding legacies of anti-racist UUs alongside our troubling history on issues of racism, eugenics, and other forms of oppression. They point to positive steps we have taken to address inequalities over the last few decades and declining resources devoted to those efforts. They point to recent internal discussions over the lack of diversity in hiring and promotion within the UUA itself, and ask us to publicly commit to raising our anti-racist beliefs to the same level as our other professions of faith. For me, the most important part of the 8th principle is that last section. By our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. When activists talk about accountability, this requires a process in which we set goals, create pathways to achieve them, and establish consequences for failure. It is much more than a simple recognition of the presence of inequality. It is the tangible effort to change those conditions for the better, and in doing so, hold ourselves accountable for our actions or our lack of action. At the same time, when so many Americans object to discussions of systemic racism, this principle reminds us that racism is much more than an individual prejudice or hatred. Yes, we need to work on our individual attitudes and actions, but we need to reshape the institutions that serve as a reflection of the collective impact and strength of those hatreds. As proponents of the 8th principle remind us, quote, "Dismantling racism, white supremacy, and other oppressions requires work at the personal and institutional levels." Over the last 8 months, many white Americans have taken the time to begin educating themselves on the realities of systemic racism in the United States. They have read and discussed anti-racist authors. They have listened to talks, attended rallies, and kept abreast of the latest discussions on a range of anti-racist issues. These are all positive first steps. And this is surely the part where some people are incredulously saying, "What do you mean first steps? This is exhausting already." Yep, this is where I have to remind you that people can be aware of racism and white privilege without lifting a finger against either. They can understand how they themselves benefit from these systems without challenging them in any substantive way. In the coming weeks and months, I hope that our congregation can have a genuine, open discussion of the eighth principle. I, for one, wholly support the idea that MVUUC should adopt it. But if we do so, if we say to the public, including other UU congregations, that we want to elevate the idea of a beloved community to an equal footing with our other beliefs, then we need to also ask ourselves, what are we willing to do to accomplish it? Because like many of you, I am tired. I'm tired of devoting so much discussion to the same issue over and over again without resolution. I am tired of the burden that we continue to place as white UUs on Black, Indigenous, Latino, and Asian UUs to continue leading these conversations in which they are routinely asked to share their most painful experiences to educate others. I am tired of paying lip service to racial equity without the needed effort to make this a reality. The more I think about it, I am tired. I'm tired of dreams. This is the time of year when we continually hear people talk about King's dream, right? The one where white and Black children hold hands together, the one where his own children are not judged by the color of their skin, the one where we all live in harmony with one another. When we highlight that dream, we sometimes forget that the word dream has two distinct meanings. A dream in King's sense can mean a goal or a vision of what might be in the future. But a dream can also be an illusion. It can be an illusion so powerful that it feels real. It can quicken our hearts, make us break out in a cold sweat, or shout out loud at people and things that do not exist. If we continue to talk about our dreams of racial equity without creating paths to take us there, without working to accomplish those goals, then we're really embracing an illusion, or perhaps a delusion, as some of us tell ourselves that racial equity is real in spite of evidence to the contrary. Now, I happen to believe that we are a strong people at MVUUC. I believe that we take the 7 principles of this faith community seriously. But I am reminded of one of the chaplains I encountered as an undergraduate, who often talked of the difference between following religious rules as they are written versus following them with love. I think that we can take up these difficult conversations and translate them into real action, motivated by our love of justice and one another. It may require a painful degree of honesty in assessing the lack of diversity within our own congregation, our responsibilities in predominantly white spaces to directly address racism, and what tangible changes we want to see in MVUUC. But it also gives us an opportunity, a genuine opportunity to create real, lasting, and positive change in the world around us. I can think of no greater monument to King's legacy than this, nor of a nobler goal for this congregation and denomination. James Baldwin reminds us, once again, of our mission. If the word integration means anything, this is what it means: that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. For this is your home, my friend. Do not be driven from it. Great men have done great things here and will again, and we can make America what America must become. May it be so.
So I'm actually doing the UU Principles Connection today, and I'm sort of acting in the capacity of board member for MVUUC, and we just wanted to back up what Tom has been talking about in his reflection today, and then also sort of present sort of the board's vision for this idea of the eighth principle. So just to sort of review it, I'm going to go over information that's available online. This information is available at eighthprincipleuu.org, and we are going to put that in the chat box at some point. But let me just lay it out very systematically here, and then I can briefly describe what the general plan is moving forward. So the proposed language of this eighth principle, and this is already in the chat, but it reads, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions." So that's the whole text of the eighth principle. And as Tom mentioned, the idea behind this eighth principle originated about 20 years ago with Paula Cole Jones. And after working with congregations on these issues for about 15 years, she realized that a person can believe they are being a good UU and following the seven principles without thinking about or dealing with racism and other oppressions on the systemic level. She realized that an eighth principle was needed to correct this, and she talked with Bruce Pollock Johnson from the UU Church of the Restoration in Philadelphia about some of the components that should be in it. Bruce put together an initial draft in 2013, and the two of them worked with a group of anti-racist activists to refine it. Bruce's congregation in Philadelphia incorporated it into their covenant at that time, and in May 2017, they formally adopted it for themselves and recommended that the UUA adopt it. So the rationale for this eighth principle, and this is also coming from that website that I mentioned earlier, two really important points about the rationale for this eighth principle. First, for people identified as white, it is too easy to ignore issues of systemic racism, which is exactly what keeps the system of racism in our society alive and in fact worsening right now. Congregations need to de-center whiteness and other dominant cultures in UUism. The second major point is that the eighth principle came from a need to renew the commitment to this anti-racist work, to hold ourselves accountable, and to fulfill the potential of our existing UU principles. Now, the proposed plan, or at least the beginnings of a plan at MVUUC, are to introduce the eighth principle, which we're doing today, and then conduct conversations at the congregational level. So actually, Bruce Pollock Johnson, who I mentioned earlier, he said there's no prescribed process for adoption, but what most congregations have done, and over 30 congregations have adopted the eighth principle thus far, the typical process seems to be to have a congregational meeting to adopt it. after a number of programs and discussions and hopefully sermons leading up to that vote. That was his description. Today's service is our effort to start these conversations, and Tom's excellent reflection today, I think, lays out a lot of the reasons why this discussion is so urgent today. So we would like to hold a congregational meeting in February to discuss the eighth principle, with the goal of holding a vote on adopting the eighth principle at MVUUC. The date of this congregational meeting and this vote have not yet been finalized, but we definitely plan to incorporate this discussion into our upcoming anti-racism coffee hour, which will be on February 21st. So you can mark that on your calendars, anti-racism coffee hour on February 21st. We encourage all MVUUC members and friends to read through the information about the eighth principle that is available at eighthprincipleuu.org, so that we can have a well-informed and meaningful conversation about this proposed principle at our congregational meeting. So thank you everyone for listening, and I look forward to our conversations in the future.
Thank you, Megan. Now more than ever, we are counting on your pledge payments and donations to help sustain and strengthen this congregation that is so important to all of us, supporting our efforts to be a community of love, truth, justice, and service. Please click on the link in the chat box or scan the QR code, and be sure to select the correct designation on the drop-down box when you donate. Thank you. And now, Lynn Israel will lead us in the song, We Would Be One.
We would be one as now we join in singing our hymn of love to pledge ourselves anew to that high cause of greater understanding of who we are and what in us is true. We would be one in living for each other, to show to all a new community. We would be one in building for tomorrow, a nobler world than we have known today. We would be one in searching for that meaning which binds our hearts and points us on our way. As one we pledge ourselves to greater service, with love and justice strive to make us free.
Our closing words today come from civil rights activist Ella Baker. We are not in the final stages of the freedom struggle. We are really just beginning. We are just beginning the freedom struggle. Let me tell you why. Because even tomorrow, if every vestige of racial discrimination were wiped out, if all of us became free enough to go down and to associate with all the people we wanted to associate, we still are not free. We aren't free until within us we have that deep sense of freedom from a lot of things that we don't even mention in these meetings. People cannot be free until they realize that peace is not the absence of war or struggle, it is the presence of justice. Please join us in reading the words for extinguishing our chalice that can be found in the comments in the chat box. As we extinguish this flame, we affirm that we are wanted, we are loved, and we are grateful for the warmth of our small but mighty community. After the service, we will turn on all videos and mics. Feel free to stay in Zoom and chat with your fellow MVUUC members and friends for our coffee hour. Please be patient, as turning on the cameras must be done one at a time, and it can take a few minutes to get to everyone. And now for our closing song, let us sing Go With a Song in Your Heart. You can find the words as a comment in the Zoom chat box.
Go with a song in your heart. Go with music in your soul. Leave with the memory of a melody. Go with a song in your heart. Go with a song in your heart. Now until we meet again. The joy of music is our gift to you. Go with a song in your heart. Leave with the memory of a melody. Go with a song. Go with a song. Go with a song in your heart.
That is the end of our service, but please stay for the virtual coffee hour that follows.